Nigeria's National Assembly has passed the 2023 appropriation bill to fund the fiscal year. If President Buhari signs in the next 3 days, his administration will have about 21.8 trillion naira to fund its final year in office. This amount is 1.32 trillion naira more than originally requested by the federal government. The total budget is at least 20% more than the 2022 budget. The country is projected to spend 744 billion naira on statutory transfers, 8.27 trillion on non-debt recurrent expenditure, 4.99 trillion naira on personnel costs, and it goes on and on. The Senate also passed more than 800 billion naira in supplementary funding for the government. This is to be drawn from domestic loans to help support flood recovery efforts. However, the Senate couldn't agree on the president's request to approve over 28 trillion naira taken from the Central Bank of Nigeria to fund government business in the outgoing fiscal year, 2022, that is. Now, President Buhari's plan is to have the already spent funds approved as a 40-year bond. The Senate plans to take a decision on this at a later date. I know this is a lot to digest, and that's why we are discussing this on The Square today. Let's make it simple for you and I. How does this affect our everyday living? Let's find out together. My name is Keminni Amanor, and you're welcome to The Square. Joining our gathering today are Iniobong Usen. He's head of research and policy advisory at BudgiT in Lagos, Nigeria. We are also joined by Ogbonna, Ukuku, his investment and economic development expert. Gentlemen, you're welcome to The Square. I'll begin with you, Iniobong.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. I'll begin with you, Iniobong. Were you surprised by the increase in budgetary allocation for the federal government as we know it now?
Yeah, good afternoon, Keminni, and thanks for having me. I must say I was quite surprised because that 1.3 trillion naira increase sort of raises the fiscal deficit. And as you know, we're confronted with very serious revenue challenges alongside expenditure challenges and debt challenges. And so if we've not carried out very important fiscal reforms or governance reforms to improve government revenue, plug leakages, limit or reduce corruption, then it's quite worrisome that we continue to put ourselves in a much more precarious situation, especially as it concerns debt management. And I know as we move along the discussion and we go more in depth into our debt challenge,
absolutely,
would unravel themselves.
Absolutely. I'll move on to Ogbonna now. Ogbonna, what do you suspect could be the thinking behind why the National Assembly ended up with a 1.32 increase in appropriations?
This thing has always reoccurred. It's not a new thing. It's something that has always happened. As soon as the budget, line items are, brought to the National Assembly to scrutinize, the Committee on Appropriation will look through it. And then there's always an increase, so it's not new. So my point has always been, why don't we prepare this budget together? Because when it comes to monetary and fiscal policy managers of an economy, funny enough, National Assembly is part of the fiscal policy managers. So why don't the MDAs and the National Assembly sit down together to prepare this budget? Because when you do that, according to them, they will say, some of these projects, we are the ones that deal with the people. We understand our terrain. We understand our locations. These are necessary projects for us. And then don't also forget, this is an electionary year. That's 2023 is an election year. So they need to do projects that will make people vote them back. So they will insist on some of those projects that they have promised their people that they will bring. Yes, there are other aspects. How are you going to fund the project, which is the major issues that we're going to be discussing today. But the fact still remains that they see some other line items as non-important as compared to their own, the items that will affect them and their people directly. So if you look at it from the increase came from the capital expenditure and then the statutory transfers, which they are also part of the recipients of those statutory transfers. So if you see, it's basically, I won't call it a selfish thing, but it's just something that bound to occur when you're dealing with people and then with the circumstances around. So, I mean, I'm not surprised and I expected it to happen.
Very well. So I'll stick with you on funding this tall order for 2023 fiscal year. The president made clear in his budget speech statement from October this year that there will be some borrowing in order to fund this budget. What are your thoughts about that?
The reality is, I have never been against borrowing. The only issue I've always had is for the past few years, we've been talking about how to scale up our income as a nation, how to get more people into the tax net, how to increase our income as a nation. And then see, until we begin to solve some of this problem, we'll continue to borrow. Now we have a lot of lifelines given to us by nature. In economic development, we call them lifelines, things that you can turn and they become money. And we are not willing to pay attention to some of those things. Little things that can actually, see, anywhere you see a problem, that means there's an income wrapped or laced around it, whether you like it or not. If security is a problem, that means that you can make income from security. I'm not trying to sound insensitive. What I'm just trying to say in essence is when you think deep, when you do critical thinking, you'll be able to see opportunities where government needs to make money. You can't, who says that serious countries don't fund their budget from rents from oil? No, what they do is those are reinvestable funds that go into sovereign wealth funds. It's from taxes. It's from tariffs that come from custom duties. I mean, there's some things that when I listen to people have conversations, I get pained because 70% of cargo all over the world travels through sea, and Nigeria is highly import dependent, and we don't have a shipping line. So all we do is we just keep everything just comes to dump. They dump it here. The structure to dump it here is all well organized, so that we are not willing to think out of the box to just begin to generate income for ourselves. If our tax to GDP is still as low as 10%, I mean, who does that? Serious countries begin to look at things that will make them generate more funds and then make more money so that they can fund this budget and will stop borrowing. But for now, we must borrow.
Yeah, and I'll have a look at some of the reforms that the president spoke about when we look at the budget proper. But I'll come to you now, Ini. We are borrowing, but the things we use the money for, and I know that Ogbonna has touched a bit on that, but how can we begin to turn that around in that when we borrow, that money or that investment can pay for itself?
So I would still like to attack the borrowing. The source of borrowing is becoming extremely problematic. It would seem that since the federal government latched on to the ways and means, it has sort of made it lazy in going after revenues. If you look at the interest on ways and means, it has increased from about 9.7 billion in 2017 to over 1 trillion naira in 2021. So you have a situation where the federal government is breaking laws, right? The rule of law is a very important component or element of a democracy. In Section 38 of the CBN Act, right, provisions have been made for advances made to the federal government through ways and means or the CBN overdrafts, like a lot of people would know that. But what we've seen over time, especially in the last 3 years, is that the federal government has continued to breach that particular section of the Act. The Act says you can make advances to the federal government, but it should be more than 5% of the previous year's revenue. Mm-hmm. And even when that is done, the federal government should not be able to access that source of borrowing in subsequent years unless what was borrowed has been paid in full. But if you follow the proceedings in National Assembly in the last few days, you would see that the federal government has breached that particular section, raised the ways and means to over 22 trillion. And I mean, it's about adding another trillion naira, which is supposed to fund the supplementary budget and has now gone back to the National Assembly to legalize that illegality. And so that sort of borrowing that just makes it easy for the federal government to just approach the CBN and borrow in large quantums, not backed up, by any sort of productivity, is very worrisome and is raising our debt service envelope. As you would see in the 2023 budget, the budget for debt service is about 6.5 trillion. If you look at our revenue estimate for 2021, it was about that figure. And so what that signals is that if we are not able to raise, if we maintain the revenues for 2021, it would mean that 100% and a little bit more would go to servicing our debt. So debt is a very, 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 very serious issue that we need to really look into and tackle.
Very well. So as we are tackling, what I want us to look at as we are tackling is what are some of the ways that Nigeria can better manage its debts? Because that it would appear that the country is robbing Peter to pay Paul every now and then. How can the country begin to reverse that? What are some of the ways, Iniobong?
There needs to be some sort of deterrent, discouragement for that sort of borrowing, because what we've seen over time is it has made the federal government lazy. And I'll tell you why. If you look at the revenue side of things, for years on ending, there were issues with oil theft that he had to reduce from about 1.8 million barrels per day to less than 1 million barrels per day. And that was only possible because it was very easy for the federal government to access funds, from some other easy means. If the federal government saw it as a very strategic revenue earner of government, it would have tackled oil theft head on. If you look at the operating surpluses, and I mean Section 48 of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, sort of mandates GOEs of the government to remit 80% of their operating surpluses to the Consolidated Revenue Fund account. But by the account of the chairman of the Fiscal Responsibility Commission, by report in 2021, the MDAs were owing the federal government in excess of 2 trillion naira. And so if the federal government is not able to mobilize or rally the MDAs under it to generate a lot of these revenues, right, so that it discourages it from borrowing through ways and means, which balloons our debt service charge, then it just tells you that it's not doing enough. Down to the utilization of the borrowings. If you follow BudgiT, you would know that about 2 weeks ago, we released a report on the quality of the review of the budget by the National Assembly. And we discovered that just looking at the 2021 and 2022 budget alone, the National Assembly had inserted in 2021 over 5,600 projects, mainly, that were constituency-like projects, boreholes, streetlights, building of community town halls, and all of that. In 2022, it rose up to over 6,400 projects, which was corroborated by the president. The president had come out to say that budget was not implementable, saying that the National Assembly had inserted projects that were outside the mandate of MDAs, that were not the business of the federal government, and that were constituency-like projects. And so if you look at the cumulative value of these projects in 2021, 2022, in each year, they were over 900 billion. If you add the 100 billion naira envelope given to them for constituency projects, it takes it to about 1 trillion naira, which is about a quarter of capital projects. And so we are borrowing funds to implement projects that do not align with the medium-term expenditure framework, do not align with the policy objectives in the National Development Plan. And so how do we get value for money?
Very well. Now, I'll move on to Ogbonna now. Ogbonna, still on our situation with debt and revenue generation. We know our shortfalls in revenue generations. In the past fiscal year, the president had promised some reforms in order to increase revenue generation. But we also have the structural problem of diversifying the economy. Over the last fiscal year, what will be your assessment, and what else really can the government do to diversify the Nigerian economy?
Yes, over the past few years, if you look at the government and all they've done, you can actually see that there was an effort made towards diversifying the economy when it comes to agriculture. Now, there are key things that will actually help you industrialize a nation. First is first, you have to have the critical mass of informed citizens, those who have the knowledge, to be able to carry out your programs and plans. You need to also have a large technology transfer, method, which is technology that you must have a destination as regards which area you want to industrialize, and then source those technology and be able to either transfer or buy over those technologies. Number three, you need to have a raw material supply strategy, which is where the agriculture comes in. Because if you have agriculture and then you are not adding value to the agricultural product that you're producing, you're just simply going to farm to feed yourself. And then number four is the market. If you have access to market, and then number five is the movement of those goods and services, which is must have a well structured infrastructure to carry out some of these projects. So diversification on a scale of 1 to 10, you can say we've done just 3. Or because one, the things that will oil that structure is not there. One, infrastructure. Two, do you have a well-designed financial products from banks to lend to those who are going to go into this business? Are you talking about Bank of Industry? How much do they have? How much capital do they have compared to the size of the economy? Are you talking about the Nexim Bank? How much they even have to give out to people? Yes, there were structures, that the central bank came up with the NISA, the credit facility that they brought out for the anchor borrowers program. Some of these things started, but again, don't forget, that was when we now had the heat from the insurgents, those who were hitting our production belt as regards agriculture. So what I'm just trying to say here is it will be difficult for anybody to get the maximum result, because the things that you need to do to make sure that you become productive are not just there. Are we talking about power? Where have we even increased in power generation and power exploitation? No. There's just so much that needs to be done. I still say.
Well, so in other words, Ogbonna, we cannot take seriously the government projections of collecting revenue, of plugging the loopholes within the government in order to be able to mop up cash or revenue in the system. We also do not hear anything about cutting down the expenditure. On the contrary, we hear a lot about spending more. What are we up against in the coming year?
Yes, what we're up against is an election year. So everybody in government, they are all looking for how to get money, especially the politicians. They will be looking for how to get monies to go and fund their elections. So that is what you're going to get. Now, the thing is, the leadership of the nation must sit down, the economic managers of the nation must sit down and say, let's begin to block some of what are these loopholes we're talking about? When remittances are not done as when due, people's, prudence when it comes to financial management, you're still buying vehicles worth 200 million naira for what? In MDAs? Who does that? In an economy where you have over 77 million people living on below poverty line. So there has to be a form of reinvestment, a rejig of the entire system so that we'll be able to channel funds to the right places. And then again, we need to work on having idle funds. Idle funds, one of the biggest problems we have. There's this, old saying that said that an idle mind is the devil's workshop. Have you ever asked what are the implements in that devil's workshop? Idle funds, one of the biggest implements in that devil's workshop. So we need to be able to restrict funds, going into wrong hands. So this is where I believe that, technology should be able to, AI technology should be able to help so that you can track where funds are going to, how they are being expended, and what they are being spent on.
The president's position would appear that he's doing quite well in automating the system in order to plug some of those loopholes. Do you believe him? Ogbonna, that's for you. That's a follow-up to your point. Well, I think we've lost Ogbonna. When he comes, we'll have him answer that question, but I'll move on to Iniobong now. Iniobong, you've been talking a lot about the debt situation, but what I want us to look at now is, do we even know what the Buhari administration used the overdraft of 28 trillion naira for over the last year. Do we know what he did with that money?
I mean, it's not clear even to the National Assembly, and that's why it was one of the requests they made while standing down that request to securitize the loan. They had asked, that the CBN governor and the finance minister appear before them to provide more details on how, the 22.7 trillion naira was utilized over time. So it's important that when this is made known to them, that it is put in the public domain. We need to know exactly how these resources have been utilized. It's money that it's taxpayers' money, it's money that we will pay back over time. And so we should have that agency to be able to know exactly how these funds are utilized. And in areas where the funds have been mismanaged, people need to be held accountable. That's something that we're not doing very well as it is. And so there's little or no deterrent for misappropriation of resources, for embezzlement of government funds. So people just feel that they can do this and, continue to live as freeborns.
When we come back, I want us to make some projections on which areas of the country's projected expenditure could be cut down in order to provide funding for other areas that need dire financing. We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us here on Village Square Africa. We are still discussing the 2023 fiscal year of Nigeria. Still with us are Iniobong, Usen, and Ogbonna, Ukuku. Gentlemen, thank you so much for staying with us on the square. And Ogbonna, before we lost you, I was asking about the president's position that they have done a lot of reforms in plugging the leakages, and that he believes that they've been able to stop money from being siphoned from the operations of the country. Do you believe him?
I believe him, but just that sometimes when you hear things, the Accountant General's office, what just happened there, you'll be like, okay, maybe these things happened in the past. We were just discovered maybe with the new reforms that have come. But let's not also forget that some of these things actually happen at the state level. There are funds that move out from our from the budget, and then nobody's able to track them. And then the statutory transfers these funds that go to some of these like National Assembly, NJC, they are not transparent. You don't see where these monies go to. So you beg, an NDDC. So you see some of these funds, when they go to those places, there's no way to track, what has happened to those funds. So I believe, yes, probably the reforms, have started yielding results. That's why some of the, corrupt practices are now being, they are hounding them down right now because of the reforms. That's what I believe, actually. So, I mean, going forward, we'll see by the end of the administration, we'll be able to know if really the president was able to plug some of those loopholes.
Very well. Before we go back to the overdraft from the CBN, I want us to look at, and I don't know if, gentlemen, you have seen the breakdown of the projected expenditure for 2023. The presidency alone is getting over 133 billion naira. That stood out to me. Is that a fair amount for I really cannot understand why it needs that much. I guess that's what I'm trying to put across. Iniobong, do you?
I mean, if you look at the breakdown of this sort of expenditure, I mean, I'll take a cue from the 2021 budget, where about 21 billion naira was allocated to the building of the hospital, the presidential wing of a hospital. And if you put together the entire budget to all of the over 30,000 primary healthcare centers across the length and breadth of this federation, it's not up to 21 billion. And so you begin to ask yourself, what does the government prioritize? You prioritize the healthcare of, over 200 million persons, or a few persons over the health of 200 million persons. You look at the presidential fleet. One of the promises that this government made coming into office was to reduce the cost of governance, especially, closest to the seat of power. And the president had said he would reduce the number of airplanes in the presidential fleet. Till today, I mean, I stand to be corrected. I don't know if that has been done. And so you still find a very weighty sort of expenditure envelope on the presidency, because we've not been able to cut waste, at that level. And so I do not think it's justified. I think the needs and preferences of the general populace should be should take precedence over and above the needs of politicians. That's my stand.
Very well. Ogbonna, what are some of the areas where we can cut wastage to put in more important areas, say education and health?
No, it's a very difficult question to answer, whether we like it or not, because the Bill of Development, there's so much, that has to happen, because if you don't have the critical mass of an informed citizenry, there's no way you can build strong institutions. You can't even have good leadership. So that means education is important. So if you don't have good healthcare system, it will be difficult for you to even provide the basic need of the people. Is it infrastructure? Is it power? So everything is very important. But the only thing I have to say here is we need to become a bit more strategic. For example, the healthcare, we need to begin to, leave healthcare to the private sector. I say this because in countries like India, okay, what they have been able to do with the healthcare system is being able to create programs where, health insurance have become the order of the day. That's why they see some of those monies that would have gone into healthcare are now being driven by the private sector. So there you'll be able to cut out some of the funds that you need, to plug into some other areas. Then when it comes to agriculture, there's still so much you need to spend money on when it comes to agriculture. Because whether we like it or not, the basic structure of making your agri sector functional is your ability to industrialize. And let's give very simple illustration. Nigeria is the largest producer of cassava in the world. Thailand is the second largest producer of cassava in the world. But Thailand makes about $2 billion from cassava. And we make less than $100 million for cassava. What does that tell you? The value addition is what we really need. So if you're able to produce and then add value, then you now begin to, make more money from agriculture. Then you now have enough money to invest back in agriculture. So I'm talking about independence right now. Okay, let's go to security, for example, which takes bulk of our money. There's still insurgency, so we have to put in a lot of money in security. But ask me, fighting insurgency and VIP protection, they're two different things. You can actually earn money from VIP protection because now it's become like a mental state. That certain level of people want to move around with sirens. It's fine. I like it. You can move around with sirens, but pay for it. Nigeria they can provide for the governors, for the maybe the speaker or the senate president, every other person that wants to move around with security. You pay adequately. It becomes an income generation for the nation. So I'm just here saying we can become more critical when we are thinking, and then we'll be able to help ourselves as a nation.
Very well. Iniobong, I just want to take you back to the CBN overdraft. What could the consequences be if the federal government is unable to pay up its debt?
Before I address the CBN issue, I want to clearly identify the waste so that we know where these things are happening. The federal government has no business allocating R1 billion, 1.5 billion naira to the installation of streetlights in remote communities that it does not have the capacity to track. It has no business allocating R1 billion, 1.5 billion naira to building, to installing boreholes or building community town halls. Mind you, this is happening at the expense of very important and strategic programs of the line ministries of government. If you pick the Ministry of Agri, for instance, which is supposed to be a very pivot ministry, right, as it regards the government strategic objective to lift people out of poverty, and you pick that budget, you would see that the National Assembly in 2022 alone had inserted over 1,200 projects in the budget of that ministry. And they did that by reducing very important programs, or the allocations of very important programs of that ministry. A program that addresses, agric extension, for instance, that provides support to smallholder farmers, was reduced by about R1 billion. a program that addresses agribusiness was reduced by 600 million naira. And all of these reductions are allocated to installation of street lights, building of community town halls that nobody can track, because now these projects are allocated to MDAs that have no business implementing these projects in the first place. So in order to be able to curb these wastes, we had suggested that there needs to be a clear interpretation of the scope, judicial interpretation of the scope of the powers of appropriation of the National Assembly. Should they continue to have the powers to just arbitrarily insert projects that sort of distorts, the policy, overall policy plan objective of the executive, which, implements the budget? Or should there be some restriction, so that we do not continue to, have a budget that is not implementable, that is not in line with the development plan, as the case may be? Back to the ways and means, which you had asked, is definitely not sustainable. This needs to stop. We cannot continue to have the CBN print money and, just give to the federal government. There are clear provisions on the CBN Act that prevents it from doing this. And so why is it easy for the CBN to just continue to lend money to the federal government against clear provisions of its own act? And it continues to do this, without giving room for the federal government to pay back. I mean, this needs to stop, because it will get to a point where our debt service, and we've seen signals for the first 4 months of this year, our debt service to revenue was about 118%. In layman's terms, what it meant was that we needed to now borrow to service our debt. And if that continues, it would mean that, I don't know, we'll probably become a distressed country as get into a debt distress, which I believe, we don't even want to envisage for our country at the moment.
Very well. I want us to also discuss Forex, Ogbonna. The budget pegs the Forex at the CBN rates, which is what it's supposed to do. But in real life, we all know that it's a lot more than that. There will be need to close that gap, or it could have impact on real spending. How could this affect the projections, Ogbonna?
And it's already going to affect the projections, whether we like it or not, because you see, by the time, yes, we have FX issues, we have scarcity when it comes to foreign exchange. Now, what the CBN is going to be doing is to, give those FX to priority, priority individual organizations like the NNPC and all of that, to continue to fund the importation of petroleum products, which we are going to be subsidizing to the populace. Now, that's not a sound move, whether you like it or not. Now, this scarcity will continue, and then that would actually distort and entice, because whether we like it or not, the scarcity is already taking a toll on the economy. Now, when the non-oil sector now wants to, get scarcity, get FX, they go to the parallel market. And when they go to the parallel market, it affects the entirety of the entire transaction, because whatever it is that they are going to do with that fund would actually, be higher. The expectation would be higher. So the finished goods, or if it's production that they are doing, the finished goods would be more expensive, which also will continue to cause a lot of inflation in the country. So I mean, we're in a state of, whether we like it or not. So there has to be a way to cushion some of this. There has to be some measures by the Central Bank of Nigeria to see how to cushion some of these issues. But it goes down to say that dollar or FX, we can only earn. We can't print. We can only earn. And when we start earning, for us to earn, we need to increase our export, and for us to increase our, effort, we need to be a bit more productive. There has to be the ecosystem for export has to be very smooth, for people to encourage a lot of exports.
You spoke about distortions, and one of those distortions we expect in first quarter, second quarter of 2023 will be the impact of elections on the economy. What are your predictions, Ogbonna?
Predictions as who will win the election?
No, not regarding the elections, about interesting view, but about how you think that election year spending could throw the fiscal year out of gear or not? How do you think things could turn out first quarter, second quarter, 2023?
First things first, the most important to me will be investors will stand on the fence right now to see how the elections will pan out. Nobody, there'll be a lot of profit taking, so there'll be a lot of standing on the fence. So what we have to make do is the spending that will happen with those, the liquidity available is what people are going to spend. So, there'll be, unless we're going to have, some remittances that is already occurring with, a lot of people coming back home for Christmas or people sending monies from abroad to their families. But when it comes to direct income, it will be a bit difficult for that kind of huge income as regards FX. And transactions will slow down a bit, because, like I said, towards an election year, a lot of profit taking happens, and a lot of investors will stand on the fence to watch the direction where the voting will go.
Iniobong, take us home on this one. For the average people living their ordinary lives, how do you think the projections of 2023 could affect or change how they're living? And while you're doing that, talk to us about how Nigeria could be positioned in 2023 in global economic transactions or interactions.
So, I foresee 2023 being, a bit challenging for Nigerians. If we take on, the positions by the major presidential candidates, especially as regards the removal of subsidy, if they are able to do that when they come into office, then you would expect that would have an immediate impact on the real income of Nigerians, as you expect that the price of goods and services in the short term would increase. And so I do expect that if they're able to, if they do that, which is good in the long term for the country, but in the short term, it would have an impact on, the real income of Nigerians, which invariably would affect their poverty level, living standards generally. Then taking a cue also from what the other guest had said also, because a lot of investors will be standing on the fence, I expect that in the first 6 months, there'll be a decline in the growth or in economic growth. So the economy would slow down because people would be, looking to take signals from where the pendulum would swing and all of that. Then in terms of even the implementation of the budget, right, which is supposed to stimulate economic activities, I expect, as is the tradition, that, a lot of resources that have been allocated to areas that are supposed to impact the lives of Nigerians generally would be diverted towards implementing the election. So this also has, and it has an implication, for the lives of the average Nigerian.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we will have to go now. Hopefully, in 2023, we will talk about Nigeria's budgets or budgetary allocations again. Iniobong and Ogbonna, I am grateful for your company. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. Thanks for having me.
Indeed. And for you at home, the Nigerian government has said it wants to improve the poverty situation in the country, improve food crisis. It also wants to improve road infrastructure, federal roads, that is. It hasn't given us an actual plan how it wants to do that. But I hope to see you in 2023. Wherever the divide is, you fall. Be safe. My name is Keminni Amanor. See you next year.